Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Hasn't been that long. It's been about 13, 14 hours since I've seen a lot of you. I was on last night addressing Maga Communism from my own perspective, and we have a really packed conversation today with a friend of the program, someone who has done incredible work on the ground all around the world, especially Latin America, uncovering how imperialism works and so much more. So we're going to get right to it. So as you're coming in, like the video, make sure you're subscribing if you're new to the channel, and be sure to hit that notifications bell. And of course, the best way to support this work is on Patreon. You can go to the description of this video to find that link. But without further ado, I want to introduce Ben Norton, who is the editor over at Multipolarity. Hey, Ben, how's it going?
It's great. Thanks for having me, Danny. It's always a pleasure being here. I always enjoy your show.
Thanks. Yes. It's been quite a while. I feel like last time we were talking about an event that was coming up for Friends of Socialist China that you participated in, but a lot has happened since then. A lot has happened. So let's just get right to it. You have at Multipolarity done quite a lot of work on what's going on in Ukraine with Russia's special military operation. And early this September, we had Ukraine's president, Volodymyr Zelensky, open up the New York Stock Exchange, saying that Ukraine was open for business. Could you explain what happened and what that means? Because I think this is often not talked about, is that there is a war, a proxy war going on over Ukraine, and the economic side of this is often left out of it. What are the consequences of this? So could you talk about more of that? And I can bring up the article so people know where to find it.
Yeah, absolutely. We need to understand that the United States, as the leader of the capitalist world system, does not in any way care about freedom and democracy. Clearly, it doesn't care about the Ukrainian people. The conflict in Ukraine is a proxy war that NATO is waging against Russia. This has been acknowledged even by the Washington Post, published an op-ed by this neoconservative Hal Brands, who's the Henry Kissinger Distinguished Professor at Johns Hopkins University. He's a former Pentagon official. He wrote an article admitting that this is a proxy war. He said that the U.S. is fighting to the last Ukrainian, and he called the war a trap that Russia was put into, a trap. We've also seen that the U.S. Defense Secretary, Lloyd Austin, who until he became defense secretary was a lobbyist for Raytheon, sitting on the board of directors of this military contractor and weapons corporation. He also said that the U.S. goal is to weaken Russia. We saw that Elliot Cohen, the former State Department official and an architect of the Iraq War in the Bush administration, he wrote an article in the Atlantic magazine saying this is a NATO proxy war in Russia. And he said the goal is to kill as many Russians as possible and weaken Russia. So there's no disputing the fact that this is a proxy war. Top U.S. government officials have acknowledged that. Now, at the same time, not only is it a proxy war in Russia, but it's a capitalist war on the people of Ukraine. And yeah, I mean, okay, Russia did violate international law by invading Ukraine, although what's never acknowledged is that the U.S. organized a coup d'etat that overthrew Ukraine's democratically elected president, Viktor Yanukovych, in 2014. In that coup, far-right extremists and fascists played a key role as the violent muscle behind that coup. They overthrow a neutral, independent, democratically elected government and installed a corrupt pro-Western puppet regime led by a billionaire oligarch. And since then, Ukraine has basically been a Western proxy regime. The Ukrainian people's sovereignty has been violated going back to 2014. And this U.S. orchestrated coup right on Russia's borders. And 14,000 Ukrainians died from 2014 until Russia sent a single troop in February of 2022. 14,000 Ukrainians died, the majority of them in Donbass, according to the United Nations. I just wanted to say all those facts really quickly, Danny, because every time I think we have a discussion about Ukraine, we have to just root the discussion in that historical context that is never, ever acknowledged in mainstream corporate media to understand everything that's happening today. And then that brings us to the question you asked. What is the Ukrainian regime doing right now? Well, yes, there's this war going on that is a proxy war. And in terms of its economic policy, the Ukrainian regime and Western corporations are using this as an opportunity They see the war as an opportunity. They refer to it as an opportunity to impose neoliberal shock therapy. And after the overthrow of the Soviet Union in 1991, we know that the US imposed neoliberal shock therapy on the Russian Federation. According to UNICEF, it led to millions of excess deaths. The average life expectancy for Russians, especially Russian men, decreased by 6 to 8 years. Malnutrition drastically increased. Millions of children were forced into poverty. There was a huge increase in public health problems like HIV and other diseases. So it was a catastrophe. No other country has ever seen this kind of humanitarian catastrophe outside of war, except for the Russian Federation when the neoliberal shock therapy was imposed on it by the US, or maybe the DPRK under brutal genocidal sanctions, or Venezuela under illegal criminal US sanctions in the blockade. So the point is that this is a war by other means. The US has been waging war on the people of Russia for many years, and Ukraine did have large privatizations, but it didn't have as thoroughly, deeply neoliberal privatizations as other parts of the former Soviet Union. And there still is significant state control over the Ukrainian economy. It's certainly not socialist, but it's not 100% privatized, right? So now the goal is to privatize anything that these Western governments and corporations can get their hands on. And Zelensky has systematically imposed Pinochet-style neoliberal economic reforms. And for people who don't know, who are watching or listening to this, neoliberal doesn't mean left-wing in any way. Neoliberal refers to the particular phase of capitalism that we're in, especially since the 1980s and 90s, in which there's no state intervention, everything is privatized, it's all the free market, it's imposed by the US and instruments like the IMF and the World Bank. Right now, Ukraine has imposed brutal labor laws that basically remove all workers' protections and make it illegal to form unions and make it illegal. There's no collective bargaining rights for workers in Ukraine right now. Furthermore, Ukraine has pushed through massive land privatization, allowing foreign corporations to control Ukrainian land. And Ukraine has always been a very largely agricultural country. It's called the breadbasket of Europe. And also, furthermore, we've seen that the most recent example, something you acknowledged, Danny, is that on September 6th, Zelensky digitally rang the bell via Zoom to open the New York Stock Exchange and announced a new program that is being created in collaboration with neoliberal economists from USAID, from the CIA cut out from the US government. He announced that the Ukrainian government is offering $400 billion in private contracts, quite literally selling state institutions and resources to U.S. corporations on Wall Street at the New York Stock Exchange, offering them $400 billion in Ukrainian assets. This is a literal example of selling off your country. He is quite literally selling Ukraine to corporations on Wall Street after making it illegal to form unions and suspending labor protections in Ukraine. I did an interview with the economist Michael Hudson. I know you've had him on your show, Danny. He's one of the best economists around today. He compared these policies being imposed in Ukraine right now to the neoliberal economic policies of the fascist Pinochet regime in Ukraine. In Chile, Freudian slip, in Chile, that was installed through a CIA coup in 1973. So what we're seeing is disaster capitalism. That's what this is called. It's disaster capitalism, and the Ukrainian people are paying for it.
Yeah. Oh, no doubt about that. And what is striking is that there is such a blackout about this. Everything that you mentioned, from the destruction in post-coup Ukraine, especially in the east and the Donbass region, all the way into now, where there has been a process. This has been, as you said, going on for many years now, since 2014, this massive privatization. This isn't something new, right? Ukraine is undergoing a process that much of the world has been forced to come under. And you said that Michael Hudson compared it to Chile. I feel like we just came out of September 11th, and there's often the reference to the CIA-backed coup in Chile that happened in 1973 on that day as a way to remember not just the 9/11 attacks and the disastrous war on terror, but also what happened to Chile. And Chile was really the center of the kind of the Chicago School of Economics kind of experimenting on Chile, using Chile as the model for the rest of the world and how imperialism would exploit it. You focus a lot on multipolarity, and you focus a lot on the world situation as it is developing. How does this economic plunder of Ukraine, Zelensky saying, we're open for business, we're open to be, we're going to sell off all the state assets. This comes at the heels of a disastrous proposal that Zelensky has put out there, where Russia is like, if this goes through, we're going to ignite a real war, because it has to do with taking back all of the land using Western imperialist weaponry and guidance. But could you talk about where does this economic situation for Ukraine fit in the global scheme of things? Like, how Ukraine is not, it's a special case, but also it has, I think, a relationship to what's happening globally and more broadly.
Well, we have to understand what neoliberalism is in order to understand this political moment, because we have to have a materialist understanding of politics, not this kind of, bourgeois liberal understanding that we hear on CNN, right? We need to understand what are the material forces driving, the economic forces driving these political decisions. The reality is that neoliberalism is simply the phase of capitalism as a global system of U.S. unipolar hegemony. It arose in the 1980s with the crisis in the Soviet-led socialist bloc and the eventual overthrow of the socialist bloc led by the Soviet Union. Of course, you had Margaret Thatcher in Britain, and we now see, the doppelganger of Margaret Thatcher just came to power in Britain, Liz Truss, continuing those policies. Of course, we had Ronald Reagan in the United States, and pretty much every single president since Ronald Reagan has been a neoliberal. And after the overthrow of the socialist bloc, the U.S. empire had no significant competitor. It was the unchallenged unipolar hegemon that could dominate the entire world, and it forced neoliberalism through institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, and then also at the barrel of a gun by simply overthrowing any country that had a state-led economic model, from Libya, which was the most prosperous country in Africa, to Iraq, to Syria, which they failed, but they tried. Of course, the U.S. also destroyed Yugoslavia, the last socialist country in Europe. And then, of course, there is constant regime change attempts in Cuba, and then later Venezuela and Nicaragua. The constant regime change attempts in China, which we saw more recently in Hong Kong, the attempts to support separatists in Xinjiang and Tibet, and now Taiwan. It's all about overthrowing any economic alternative to neoliberalism. And of course, what we've seen is that countries like Ukraine are being sacrificed at the altar of neoliberalism, which really, not only is it the phase of capitalism of U.S. unipolar hegemony, but it's also completely financialized capitalism. We saw that industrial growth in the United States came to an end really in the 1970s, and we saw the outsourcing of jobs, and we saw that there was a complete deindustrialization of large parts of the United States that is only possible through a system of imperialism, right? You rely on cheap products and raw materials being extracted from the global south, super exploitation of low-paid labor in the global south, and then you get those industrial goods from exploited labor in the global south, and then you have a financialized service economy in the imperial core, right? That's the only way that system can work. And so neoliberalism, again, as Michael Hudson stresses, is a system of financial capital, not a system of industrial growth. And the U.S. capitalist system has tried to impose this model around the world. And we now see that Ukraine is the latest victim of this. Now, yeah, obviously the war is very tragic. Many people are dying in Ukraine. I want to remind listeners here that Ukrainians are not only dying, they're being conscripted to go fight. So a lot of people are not even choosing to go fight and die, right? Like, this is a horrible tragedy in this proxy war. And what are they getting out of it? They're maybe going to join the European Union. That's what Ukraine keeps saying, and the EU says Ukraine's going to join the EU. What does that mean? The EU says in order to join the EU, you have to impose neoliberal economic policies. You have to do mass privatizations. Nationalization is illegal in the European Union. In order to nationalize something, you have to have contracts and you have to bid it to private corporations. And then the state has to offer a higher bid than all of the private corporations. That's the only way to nationalize something. And even then, there's all these laws saying that, you can't compete with corporations and all that. The European Union is, by its very nature, its structure, a neoliberal capitalist institution. So what they're saying is Ukraine is sacrificing its people to be even more thoroughly integrated into the US-led imperialist world system, sacrificing its natural resources, which are very plentiful, sacrificing its land and its labor, so they can super exploit Ukrainian labor. And this is all part of another larger process of forcibly subordinating the European economy to the US economy. So the same process of deindustrialization that we saw and offshoring and outsourcing of jobs and industry in Europe, I mean, the same process we saw in the United States in the 1970s, that's exactly what is being done now to Europe. German industry is being destroyed because Germany can't buy cheap energy. Large parts of European industry are being destroyed. So the reality is that the people of Ukraine and working people in Europe in general are basically sacrificing their economies to the US empire. And all in the name, it's not just because the US wants power for the sake of power. It's in the name of corporate profits. Wall Street is the one driving this agenda. It is capitalism, the neoliberal phase of capitalism, that is driving this agenda. It has nothing to do with human rights, nothing to do with democracy.
And isn't it so fitting that Zelensky opened up the New York Stock Exchange announcing also this? It would have been one thing if it was just a political statement, right? If it was just, look at me, I'm the so-called democratic leader that you're all supporting and thank you for your support. But no, there was a whole agenda laid out that was obviously given to him by those very forces at the New York Stock Exchange. And it's just so fitting. And I think one thing that often isn't considered, even for those who talk about multipolarity and this shift in global relations, is everything you're saying about the global neoliberal order is being countered by those forces who are trying to chart a different path, who are trying to chart a multipolar world, because across the board, this includes Russia. And I want to make a note about what you said about Ukraine sending everyone to die, conscripting, treating this like an out-and-out war. Russia's not doing that. Russia is limiting its soldiers. It does not have forced conscription. It is not sending all troops down the line, all of its civilians into harm's way. There's a different approach here. This is a battle to the last Ukrainian, and it's the West in Ukraine that's actually spurring that. But, and of course, we can get into the fact that a peace deal was killed. We already know one time back in April that you also covered. So, but I want you to comment anything there, and also comment on this idea of neoliberalism being challenged by multipolarity, because not Russia, not China, not any of the countries in Latin America, Africa, Asia, none of them are asking for these kind of concessions. None of them are saying, if we're going to trade with you, you have to open up all of your state assets and basically give it to all of our private shareholders. They're not doing that. So what is this difference, and why is it not being talked about in this way?
Well, yeah, on this is why I keep citing the economist Michael Hudson, because I think if people really want to understand what neoliberalism is, they should study his work, read his books, check out his articles and interviews. I mean, because he has really influenced my understanding that neoliberalism is inextricably tied to U.S. foreign policy and U.S. imperialism. Again, it is the phase of capitalism that we've been living in since the 1980s of U.S. unipolar hegemony, when there were no systemic alternatives challenging U.S. imperialism. And just as at the peak of the British Empire imposed so-called free trade and the free market on the colonies and on countries where it was dominating. I mean, this is how imperialism, the economics of imperialism functions. I mean, we can talk about, of course, the blunt neo-colonial force of the U.S. war machine, right? The military simply invading countries, overthrowing their elected governments. Clearly, I mean, that's one arm of imperialism. But there's also the economic form of imperialism that sometimes can be a little more subtle in the sense that it's not as clearly obvious as the U.S. bombing a country, right? But sanctions kill just as many people as bombs, right? And these neoliberal policies and these structural adjustment policies imposed on countries often kill just as many people as military wars, as conventional wars. And we've seen, for instance, that just as the British Empire forced so-called free trade on colonies, like India, parts of Africa, parts of Latin America, it forced them to open their borders, to drop all tariffs, to make their goods, completely uncompetitive with the British subsidized goods. So the British Empire would flood the colony with British textiles, for instance, in the case of India, and Indian textile workers couldn't compete because the British textiles were subsidized by the British state. But the Indian state, which was a puppet regime of the British Empire, was not allowed to subsidize its own domestic textile industry, which means that the domestic textile industry was destroyed, and it forced all of these workers out of their jobs to be exploited, right? This is exactly what the U.S. empire does. We can see it in places like Haiti, where the U.S. destroyed the Haitian agricultural sector and then flooded Haiti with extremely low quality rice that was subsidized by the U.S. to destroy Haitian agriculture, to make Haiti dependent on U.S. agriculture, to make the people dependent on the U.S. empire so they can't be independent. A key part of the economics of imperialism is destroying food sovereignty in nations, destroying local agriculture, and making that country dependent on the U.S. agricultural sector, which is subsidized by the state, as a form of blackmail to control a country by controlling them through their food supply. We saw that NAFTA, this neoliberal free trade agreement signed in 1994, that did the same thing to the Mexican agricultural sector, pushing millions of Mexican agricultural workers off their land so large U.S. big ag corporations could monopolize the agricultural sector. We're now seeing the same exact process happen to Ukraine. This is how neoliberalism functions. It's not, and this is how capitalism functions, but especially in the financialized neoliberal era. It's not about development. It's about de-development. It's about extraction of resources, super exploitation of labor. It's not about developing these countries. And you raise such a key point, Danny. China in particular offers a separate model of development that is actually based on development, state-led socialist development. In China, all of the land is owned by the state, all of it. In China, the commanding heights of the economy are owned by the state, which is governed by a communist party. In China, the 40% of the GDP comes from state-owned companies, construction companies, infrastructure companies, communications, telecommunications run by the state on behalf of the people, right? All of transportation, right? So yeah, not everything is nationalized like in the Soviet Union. It's a slightly different model. We can talk about the differences, but the reality is that China offers a fundamentally distinct model. It is in no way similar to the neoliberal model that the US empire has been imposing in the world for over 30 years now. And even Russia, which does not have a socialist model, it has an industrial capitalist model with significant state leadership in the economy. A large percentage of GDP in Russia comes from state-owned companies. The estimates are between 30 to 40%. And the largest companies in Russia are state-owned. Gazprom, which is the largest company in all of Russia, it's the gas giant, that is. The gas is owned by the state, and Gazprom is used to fund state revenue. We also see that oil and other natural resources are owned by the state. The largest banks are owned by the state, like Sberbank. So yes, Russia doesn't have the same kind of socialist model that it had in the Soviet Union or China does, but it is not the same as the US and European neoliberal model that the US empire is trying to impose on the world. That's the main reason, honestly, along with the independent foreign policy of the Russian Federation. That's the main reason why the US empire and US capitalists have been so desperate to try to overthrow the Russian government. It's not even really about Putin, right? I mean, Putin, when he first came in, he was brought in to the U.S. thought he was going to be a more effective manager of Russian capitalism than the alcoholic U.S. puppet Boris Yeltsin that they installed. And then at first, Putin thought that Russia could maybe be integrated into the West in this world system, and the West refused to have it. And Putin refused to subjugate his country and turn his country into a Western colony. He said that very many times. He said, we wanted to integrate with the West, and they refused to have us on equal terms. They only want us to be a colony. So he was forced to create a separate model of economic development, not because he's ideologically a socialist, but to prevent his country from being cannibalized by Western capital. And this is exactly why the U.S. is so desperate to overthrow the Russian government. It wants to reprivatize all of the oil and all of the gas and the huge mineral reserves and gold and other significant natural resources that Russia has. All of that was privatized in the 1990s. It has slowly been renationalized by the Russian state, and then that revenue is used to fund social services in Russia. So that we're talking about a fundamental difference between the financialized neoliberal capitalist model that the US and Europe are trying to impose on the world and the socialist state-led model in China and the state-led, industrial capitalist model in Russia. So yes, China and Russia have differences, but they have more in common economically and politically than the neoliberal West. So the first Cold War was a class war. The first Cold War that ended in 1991 was a war between capitalism and socialism. The Soviet Union was the leader of the socialist bloc. The United States was the leader of the capitalist bloc. After the overthrow of the Soviet Union and counter-revolution in much of the world, the first Cold War ended and capitalism won. Neoliberalism was imposed on the world. Well, slowly countries, especially in the global South, have been trying to free themselves from neoliberalism. And now we see the new Cold War. And the second Cold War, like the first Cold War, is also a class war. And it is a war between different systems. It is a war between neoliberal financialized capitalism and state-led national development of the economy on behalf of the country and not just financial capital.
Definitely. I'll never forget. This will be probably a highlight in my life. One of them is going to China and have someone in the Beijing Friendship Association laugh in all of our faces when someone asks the question, hey, is your central bank, is it partially private like the United States? Is it controlled by private interests, by Wall Street or a kind of Wall Street? And she laughed and was like, why would you give your financial sector to private shareholders? That means nothing good will happen for the country. Like, she was just very simple. She's like, nothing good will happen for the country. Everything is going to go out of the country. And it just still shows that all of the big banks, the vast majority, I think it's something like 80+%, are state owned in China, the banks, and they follow what the government says through the plan, and they spend the money where it needs to be spent. And that's why things look a lot differently. That's why you don't have the same neoliberal cutthroat economic policies in China and China's policies abroad. That's also why, because a lot of this is money. It's the Import-Export Bank, the Exim Bank, the Export-Import Bank. It's money. It's money that's being then given to whether it's private capital or state-owned industries to go use for certain projects in collaboration with other countries. And if they don't follow the rules, they're not going to get the money. So that is just basic economics. I know Michael Hudson does a really good job, but let's segue now, okay? Because
one quick note, Danny,
okay,
just really briefly here. If people look at the list of the top 5 biggest banks on earth, just strictly in terms of the amount of capital they have, the top 4 biggest are Chinese state-owned banks that have nearly $20 trillion in capital. And then the 5th biggest is JP Morgan Chase, the biggest US bank. So, can you even imagine the idea of a state-owned bank in the US? It's just crazy. Like, this is the idea of a state-owned bank that operates on behalf of workers and the people.
It is very, I mean, the United States had something like that during the recovery of the Great Depression, but it never had anything like a public banking system. And the public banking movement, because I know there's some followers who follow this channel, probably follow yours as well, follow your work. There's a lot of frustrations about it because of how alien a concept that is, how just we've been living under the rule of financial sector banking monopolies for so long, several generations now, that it's something that is very alien. But in other parts of the world, and now in this multipolar trend where you have 2 major big countries focusing and prioritizing even just that one area, it's a seismic wave. It's a complete shift in how the neoliberal world order does things.
Well, yeah, and Danny, briefly, when we talk about those 2 countries, of course, you're referring to China, which has the biggest economy in the world according to purchasing power parity, which is a much better measurement than just like GDP in US dollars, considering people in China don't use US dollars. And then, of course, the other country you're talking about is Russia, which, if you measure their economy in PPP, it's like the 6th or 5th largest economy, but it's a significant power. And of course, their allies, their strategic allies, But we also should talk about the other block that they're building, right? Which is the BRIC system: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. We also know that Iran and Argentina are probably going to be joining BRICS soon. And we also see the creation of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which includes not only China and Russia, but also India, the second most populous country on earth, and Pakistan, and Iran is joining as well, and major significant countries in Central Asia, like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan. So we're talking about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization includes 40% of global population, more than 30% of global GDP, and then the BRIC system, which is expanding. So they're part of this construction of a new bloc, an economic bloc, a political bloc, and they have differences. There, of course, are significant differences between the Indian government and the Chinese government. The Indian government is, very objectionable. Currently, it's led by a very right-wing party that's very much against working people. That's not the point. The point is that large parts of the global South that were colonized for hundreds of years by European colonialists and U.S. neo-colonialists have been trying to create institutions to finally be able to find a new path of development outside of the control of Western colonialism and neo-colonialism. That's what we're seeing here. The process of multipolarity is not just about the rise of China and the re-rise of Russia after it was subjugated and partially colonized by Western capital. It's also about the rise of global South nations that were colonized for hundreds of years. So China's growth is absolutely incredible, and it's one of the most remarkable political and economic developments in history, thanks to the leadership of the Communist Party of China. But we're also talking about the significant economic rise of Indonesia, of Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria. Like, this is and of course in Latin America, Brazil, Mexico, Argentina. We're talking about a process of the global South finally being able to pursue a somewhat independent path of development. So even though some of those paths are not socialist, obviously we as socialists would prefer those paths being socialist, and we're going to work toward them being socialist, as in the case of China and Venezuela and Vietnam. So, Nicaragua, Cuba, more countries should pursue that path. But even aside from that, what we're seeing is that this multipolar order allows countries that were quite literally colonized for hundreds of years to finally be able to develop independent of neocolonialism. And that alone, even though it's not necessarily socialism, is a significant, important step for humanity. And it's also a step towards socialism, because you can't develop socialism if you're partially colonized.
Yeah, it's so true. And just another quick note before we transition, I wanted to just mention also that what's significant about the rise of these, what could be called in Leninist terms, oppressed nations, right, that have this history of being targeted, brutalized, plundered by imperialism, rising in this way. What's also significant about this is that it runs very much along with the decline of the American empire, of the imperialist world system. And there's debate about this, because I'm saying, well, look at the massive profits. Look at how the United States still dominates the international system. Look at what is happening to Europe. And surely this is not to say that the United States is, on the way out, that imperialism is just on the way out. But it is to say, when you have countries like India, right? We have countries like India, which have incredibly hostile, in some areas, relations with China. There's been a significant development where their border dispute has been nearly resolved at this point. That's just happened in the last couple of weeks. But when you have India and so many countries that could easily, right, fall underneath the U.S. and Western neoliberal imperialist camp, moving toward China and Russia and saying there is no other option, very publicly, oftentimes. Even Saudi Arabia, I know you covered this on your channel, we covered it here. Even Saudi Arabia saying, absolutely not, we are not going to cut relations with China, because China, guess what? They built all of our 4G and they're building our 5G base stations. They're building everything for us. Why would we do that, right? Why would we that would put our political capital at risk. It's not as if the Saudi regime needs any more reasons to be illegitimate. So that's often also not talked about. The U.S., in its leading this neoliberal order, is having trouble holding on. It is having trouble holding on because there are now options. It's not post-Soviet Union world order anymore. There isn't. China is not weak anymore. Russia is no longer dismembered and completely plundered. And also, these smaller countries now have good friends. Now they have reliable partners, and they can also brave storms with much more effectiveness than they would be able to before. Despite, I know you're in Nicaragua, I know you've been to Venezuela, there's immense suffering from sanctions, but still able to make progress, in part both because they have trustworthy friends now, and also in part because of their own, as you said, on their own volition and their own abilities and their own capacity to keep their movements, their sovereignty protected.
No, I couldn't agree more, Danny. And that's why I think it's so important to talk about all of this, and especially with a socialist perspective, right? Because it is true, I've acknowledged this, that there are some people talking about multipolarity who are more right-wing and conservative. Their vision of the world is very different. But the point is that multipolarity offers space for countries, especially in the global south, to have independent alternative paths of economic development. And that includes socialism. So obviously our goal is building towards socialism. And the reality is that under a unipolar system in which the US empire and US corporations and Wall Street and the IMF and the World Bank impose neoliberal structural adjustment policies on any country that wants to try to develop its economy, you can't develop socialism in those circumstances. There are a few honorable exceptions that we should acknowledge. Cuba survived that unipolar moment, but in the 1990s, the situation in Cuba was very difficult in the so-called special period, when its largest trading partner, the Soviet Union, was overthrown. Also, the DPRK went through a very difficult period around the same time. So there were countries that survived. The point, though, is not just to survive. The point is to thrive and develop the productive forces and raise the living standards of working people. And we now see that in Cuba, in Venezuela, in Nicaragua, in Bolivia, in Latin America. They're engaging on those processes of developing their economies with the help of China, of Russia, of Vietnam, of Iran. Iran plays an important role in this as well. We didn't talk about Iran. I mean, obviously, the Iranian government has a different model, and it's not a model that I would personally, prefer. But I'm not Iranian. It's up for the Iranian people to choose their own political model, right? And the reality is that the Iranian economic model, which is almost never discussed. We constantly hear about the religious elements of the Iranian political model, but the economic model is also another model with significant state control of the economy. The oil is owned and exported by the state, right? People talk about the famous 1953 CIA-backed coup against Mohammad Mossadegh for nationalizing Iran's oil. Well, what they often forget is that today Iran's oil is still nationalized. It's still owned by the state, right? And large parts of the Iranian economy are still run by the state in this same way, right? A kind of economic nationalist model. It's not a socialist model, but it is an economic nationalist model in which significant resources and parts of the economy are owned and run by the state on behalf of the population to maintain economic stability and also to prevent the country from being colonized. Because if a country's resources are controlled by foreign corporations and those resources are used to fund revenue for the state, then that country is partially colonized. You can't say that country is economically or even politically sovereign. And this is why the famous Ghanaian leader and socialist Nkrumah talked about neo-colonialism, because many countries in the global south are still trapped under neo-colonialism. They got formal independence on paper, at least political independence from colonialism, but their economies are largely controlled by Western capital. And what we're seeing, this process of multipolarity, is also just simply a process of some countries in the global south freeing themselves from neocolonialism.
Yeah. Well, let's transition now, okay? Because the last topic on the order of the day for this conversation is this concept of Maga Communism. So I know that there have been Twitter exchanges, there have been, unfortunately, name calling, which I found to be just not in good taste. But let's talk about the idea, okay? Because, we both consider ourselves socialists, not socialist as in small d democratic socialist, but socialist in the tradition of communism and Marxism. So I want to know your thoughts about this, and perhaps, let's just throw out maybe like a devil's advocate question. I addressed this last night on my stream. It isn't for me. I don't need. I'll definitely comment what you have to say, but I don't need to open with a big introduction about my opinion on it. But let me just ask you a question. So a lot of the criticism against our position, and in your position in particular, is, well, you don't want to go to the working class whites. You don't want to appeal to them. You don't want to try to win them over to communism. What would you say, or you don't want to unite them, should we say, against the forces of globalism? I don't even want to use that term. Let's just say global capital for our sake, the deep state. You don't want to do that because you're not willing to engage with MAGA. What do you have to say to that?
I mean, it's ridiculous on so many levels. Just a few things. First of all, globalism doesn't exist. It's a right-wing buzzword. It's called imperialism and capitalism. And we have to have a scientific economic understanding of what imperialism is and how it operates. Globalism is a term that obscures that and tries to separate imperialism from capitalism. And if you try to do that, you can't understand what's actually happening. Second of all, the idea that, like, I'm not interested in challenging the deep state is very funny and hilarious, because I, at Multipolarista, in fact, have a series with the leftist historian Aaron Good, a Marxist influence historian, and it's called Empire and the Deep State. And it's a history of the US empire and the US deep state, from a materialist, socialist understanding to actually grasp at what the deep state is as the reflection of the US capitalist class, of large corporate oligarchs, of capitalist interests driving the interests of the US state and the US empire. If you try to separate capitalism and a materialist understanding from imperialism and the deep state, all you're going to do is end up getting weird right-wing racist conspiracies about, like, Jews or the Illuminati or whatever. Like that, we need to have an actual understanding. Now, let's talk about this idea of so-called MAGA communism. It's ridiculous on so many levels. First of all, we need to separate this whole idea of the so-called white working class from MAGA. First of all, the working class is not white. The working class has no race. The working class is international. There are white workers, but the white working class, it does not exist. There's no white working class. There is a working class, and there are white workers, and there are black workers and Asian workers, but it is a working class, right? The idea of, like, going after the white working class, that's another form of identity politics. Why are you trying to appeal specifically to white people? You should appeal to workers on a working class basis. The idea that I don't know anything about, like, white workers is absurd. Like, my family's from Ohio, like from Cleveland, Ohio, which is a deindustrialized area. I went to school in Kentucky. Like, I know these parts of the United States quite well, right? Okay, MAGA is not a political movement. MAGA is not a movement. MAGA is a campaign slogan created by Donald Trump, quite literally on a hat, a merchandising slogan used to run for election as U.S. president, which is the commander-in-chief of the U.S. empire on behalf of the U.S. capitalist class. There can never be anything progressive, yet alone revolutionary or anti-hegemonic or anti-systemic about MAGA. Quite literally, it is a campaign slogan linked at the umbilical cord to Donald Trump. When they say MAGA, they mean we support Donald Trump. You can't separate that from Donald Trump. He literally coined the term. He literally put it on his hats that he sold in his campaign site and used it to run for president. Okay, now let's talk about Donald Trump himself. The idea that all white workers in the United States support Donald Trump is preposterous. It is completely ridiculous. All right, in 2016, in the presidential election, there was 56% voter turnout. 56% voter turnout. That means 44% of eligible voters did not participate. That's not including the large numbers of people in the United States who have been disenfranchised, especially disproportionately black people. Okay, 46% of the 56% turnout voted for Trump. That's 63 million people. That is 25% of adults in the United States voted for Donald Trump in 2016. In 2020, there was 67% voter turnout, so a little higher, and 47% voted for Trump. That's 28% of US adults. So in both elections, we're talking about just around 1/4 of people voted for Donald Trump. Okay, why are we not talking about the 44% of people who did not vote in the 2016 election? I think that that's a much more opportune base for people to recruit if you're looking to try to build socialism, to build a movement outside the two capitalist imperialist parties. Why are these opportunists only trying to go after people who support Donald Trump? Because it's not political for them. They don't actually believe this, I think, in many senses. This is strictly grifting. It is opportunism. They're making money off of it. They recognize there's a large base of right-wingers who have a lot of money, because another part of this is that the people who voted for Donald Trump were not disproportionately working class. On the contrary, they were disproportionately upper middle class in wealthy suburbs. On average, they were more affluent than people who voted Democrat. Now, I'm not supporting voting Democrat. I've never voted Democrat. I have never supported voting Democrat. I have an established record of this going back much longer than the so-called Maga Communists, many of whom were Democrats quite literally 3 years ago, running for office on a mainstream liberal democratic platform, literally in 2019. Okay? So why are we not talking about the tens of millions or potentially over 100 million people in the United States, working class people who are disenfranchised, who don't believe in the political process, who recognize correctly that both ruling class capitalist imperialist parties do not serve their working class interests? Why are people instead doing a reverse lesser evilism? And this, to me, Danny, is incredible, because what they're doing is exactly what the social democrats were doing in the past 10 years, is to say we have to vote Democrat because they're lesser evil. All these so-called MAGA communists, who are not communists in any way, according to any consistent definition of the term, they're not even socialists. These people are doing the exact opposite. They're doing a reverse lesser evilism. They're saying that we should recruit among Republicans. We should basically cater our politics to the Republican Party and say that the Republicans are lesser evil and tell people quite literally to vote for Donald Trump. That's what these so-called MAGA communists are doing, literally. They're saying vote for Donald Trump. This is the exact polar inversion of the pro-imperialist liberals like Vosh, who say vote for the Democrats every year, vote for Joe Biden. They're the polar inversion of each other. Ironically, they're both patriotic so-called socialists who wag the genocidal U.S. flag and talk about how great the U.S. is. They're quite literally polar inversions of each other. That's why I've mostly avoided this. It's a distraction. They're not serious. They're not socialists. They're certainly not communists. What they're trying to do is redefine communism and redefine socialism to say that actually we're conservatives, but we're also communists. What are you talking about? They're actually just redefining communism. They certainly have no theoretical understanding of Marxism, Leninism. Give me a break. They're redefining even socialism to make it the same as conservatism and say, oh, we're just conservatives. And of course, at the end of the day, they're profiting from it. These people are profoundly unserious. They're not a member of a party. They're not a member of an organization. They don't believe in collective action. They believe in their own personal brands to make money, to sell gold, quite literally, to do ads to sell gold alongside Steve Bannon and Ron Paul for this company called Birch Gold. This is not a project for political transformation, and it's profoundly unserious. And that's why before and after, I have refused to engage with them. Today, I wanted to engage with this ridiculous concept, but after this, I'm just going to ignore it because it's all grifting. It's not a serious political tendency.
And even if, in my opinion, right, like for me, we can obviously see, and I think a lot of what you brought up is that it is totally reasonable to assume, right? Especially with some of the actions and especially the name calling and then all of the ways that this has been approached, right? Can definitely get the sense that this is not serious. But even if we were to concede, right, that, all right, grifting this or that, whatever, like we can concede, let's just take that, shelve that. When we even just look at the idea, however, right, the idea of this, I think the most poignant point that you made and that I wholeheartedly agree with is that there's no reflection upon what this means strategically, right? Because on the one hand, if you are a working class white person who lives in a Trump-dominated area, right, and you're trying to organize them in some kind of way, this is just an abstract thing, you're trying to organize them some kind of way toward socialism, then if that's your strategy and you're just doing a poor job by saying we're going to do MAGA communism and that's the strategy, then I think I would be a little more forgiving and even just more open about this as a trend. But that doesn't, it's just, that's just not what it is, because there's this big kind of elephant in the room of, well, you have the majority of young working class people already thinking about socialism. You have the material conditions where you have most people in the United States either holding their nose for either party or not voting at all because, as you said, they're disenfranchised, or they're just not voting. So you have this massive base of people who are willing to talk about alternatives, third parties, socialism. And we're focusing on a very small subsection where only a small subsection of that MAGA camp, if we can even call it a MAGA camp, people don't vote for Donald Trump or anybody really underneath MAGA all the time. People swaying back and forth. If you want to focus on the entire working class, then why is it that there's so much of the working class that's being ignored? And with this framing, it inherently alienates a large subsection of that working class. For me, my big problem is you are seeding everyone who is, you could call them under the Democratic Party camp, or for maybe fun terms, right? America was already great camp, because that's how the Democratic Party views the MAGA camp, right? It's MAGA. What are you talking about? America's already great. That's what Hillary Clinton said. That's what Obama, all these neoliberals said. So you're conceding everyone who may be in that camp, but is very disillusioned by it, disaffected, and thinking about socialism, they're organizing labor unions in places that have never been organized before. They're thinking about socialism seriously. Why are we what is, for me, what is the interest in going for MAGA, right? What for me, it doesn't make any sense in that way. It's not good strategy. No one is saying ignore everybody who voted for Trump. Certainly, if people are open and willing to hear things and change their opinion, then of course we should talk to them. But at the same time, that's another abstract scenario. We're talking about the reality of the situation, of this being targeting maybe a very active online segment of the population, but very marginal section of the population in terms of the actual existing conditions of the United States. And we're not even talking about the rest of the world.
Yeah. So the argument that these so-called MAGA communists, who are the same as the patriotic socialists, I mean, it's the same people, and it's the same argument. And of course, the so-called patriotic socialists have a lot in common with the so-called national socialists, especially considering neither is socialist. We'll talk about that in a second. I mean, there's a significant fascist undercurrent here that we need to understand theoretically, but we'll get to that in a second. First of all, let's talk about this idea that if you oppose MAGA, you oppose white people or something, which is just insane white identity politics. These people criticize so-called identity politics. They're promoting white identity politics. The reality is that working class white people in the United States have a variety of views. Some vote for Republicans, some vote for Democrats. The majority don't vote. And again, we need to look at the actual class position of many of the people who voted for Trump. They were disproportionately petty bourgeois, so-called upper middle class, wealthy people in the suburbs, especially, what Trump called the boat owners or whatever, his great boat people in Florida, referring to like all of these people living in these gated communities in Florida who are the small business owners who exploit multiple employees and have like boats or whatever. The beautiful boat people is what he called them, I think. So we're not talking about working class people. We're talking about petty bourgeois. Honestly, if you want to look at the class conflict between the Republicans and the Democrats, it is largely a conflict between the national bourgeoisie elements in the United States and financial bourgeois. And obviously, both are enemies of socialism, especially in the context of an empire. Trump's base are largely those national bourgeois construction elements, petty bourgeois elements. And then, of course, behind the Democrats, you have financial capital, you have Silicon Valley. Both parties are thoroughly capitalist, neoliberal, imperialist parties. And Trump himself governed as a complete neoliberal and as a complete imperialist. Not only did he wage an economic war in Venezuela, killing thousands of Venezuelans with illegal murderous sanctions and overseeing a right-wing coup attempt. Not only did he oversee the far-right coup against Evo Morales in Bolivia, not only did he kill Qasem Soleimani, the top Iranian general, and basically try to start a war with Iran while expanding sanctions on Iran. Not only did he expand the sanctions on Cuba and try to destroy Cuba, not only did he expand the war on Yemen, not only did he refuse to end the war in Afghanistan that he claimed he was going to do, not only did he boast about occupying militarily the oil-rich regions and wheat-rich regions of Syria and boast that we're taking their oil, not only did Trump recognize Jerusalem, occupy Jerusalem as the fake capital of apartheid Israel and provide even more support for apartheid Israel, not only did Trump continue expanding the U.S. empire in all of those ways, furthermore, Trump oversaw the largest wealth transfer from working class to capitalist class in modern history with these tax breaks for the rich. There's in no way can you call Trump a pro-working class president, or MAGA, which is not a movement. Again, it's a campaign slogan. It is in no way pro-working class. If you talk to a lot of poor white workers, as I've done in Appalachia, again, I went to school, high school and college in Kentucky. I've been to rural Appalachia, to areas that were devastated by mountaintop removal, by surface mining. I have family members who had factory jobs in Cleveland, Ohio, and they lost their jobs. They had good union jobs, and they lost their jobs through offshoring. It's not like I've never talked to working class white people. Like it's absurd. Like a lot of them don't believe in politics. They always say that the U.S. political system is corrupt. It's hopelessly corrupt. It can't be changed. It doesn't matter who you vote for because nothing will change. I have family members, a lot of family members in Ohio who voted for Trump. And a lot of them ended up saying, well, actually, Trump ended up not really changing anything. So these opportunists who are not communists, talking about so-called Maga Communism, they're simply grifters. They're trying to appeal to a right-wing base to make money. And what we should talk about, Danny, is they're more than willing to throw Black people under the bus, indigenous nations under the bus, Latinos under the bus, and especially LGBTQ people under the bus. We see them saying blatantly anti-trans, blatantly homophobic things. Like trans people are some of the most marginalized, oppressed people in the United States. The Democratic Party, for opportunistic reasons, has pretended to kind of care about trans people, although it's done nothing to actually help them. So these opportunists say, oh, the ruling class supports trans people, therefore we should throw trans people under the bus. These are the most marginalized people in society. Why are you demonizing them? They're just scapegoating poor, marginalized, oppressed people to build their followings. That's the definition of opportunism. There's nothing progressive or left-wing and certainly revolutionary or socialist about that. They're also saying that we should reach out to literal white supremacists. Not every white worker is a racist. A lot of white workers actually interact more commonly with Black people and Latinos and indigenous people than white capitalists living in their elite bubbles, working, at a big corporation or whatever. The idea that like all white workers in rural areas are all just like racist white supremacists, therefore, we should be racist to appeal to them. That is condescending to them. These racist Republicans do not represent average white working people. The whole point of this fake right populism is they're pretending to appeal to workers, ironically, by using identity politics. So you see Hannity and like all these Fox pundits, they're like, oh, we're the smelly Walmart people, right? Like we shop at Walmart. That's not appealing to working class people. That is literally identity politics. So this is completely ridiculous. And this idea, for instance, they talk, for instance, about the Young Patriots. They don't know anything about the Young Patriots. The Young Patriots were revolutionary socialists who protested against police brutality. And yes, unfortunately, At the beginning, they used the Confederate flag, but when they began collaborating with the Panthers, they were convinced to stop using the Confederate flag. They recognized that the Confederate flag was a symbol of white supremacy and slavery. They stopped using it, and their leaders, their co-founders, said very clearly, we have to combat against racism. We have to fight racism. So why do these opportunists think that literal racists like Tucker Carlson, he's a literal white nationalist. You can watch his show. He talks about how immigrants are taking over the country. He talks about great replacement theory. He referred to Iraqis as semi-illiterate primitive monkeys.
He talked about the British Empire as being the most benign that's ever been, and for India,
civilized India.
For India. Look at that train station in India. Forget the massive famines and mass slaughters during.
Or Marjorie Taylor Greene, who referred to Black Lives Matter, a mass movement. And yes, there were Democrats who tried to opportunistically co-opt it. There were corporations and foundations that tried to co-opt it. I've been very critical of that. But Black Lives Matter fundamentally has always been rooted in a working class Black struggle led by poor, marginalized Black communities. And yeah, there are opportunists working for the Ford Foundation, but they're not the actual leaders. And the reality is that this is a massive movement with huge popular support and strong revolutionary potential. And these opportunists are saying that we should attack Black Lives Matter, attack anti-fascists. They literally attack anti-fascists and Antifa. And they say that Black Lives Matter is all, Soros or whatever, which is, by the way, I mean, of the people on the left, I've been critical of Soros, along with other billionaire capitalist oligarchs who work with the CIA and CIA cutouts to do counterinsurgency against the left. I've criticized Soros, but you have to do it within a particular context. Just saying that they're all Soros is verging on anti-Semitic dog whistle that the right wing uses. Like if you talk about Soros, but you don't talk about Pierre Omidyar, if you don't talk about Jeff Bezos, if you don't talk about the Rockefeller Foundation and the Ford Foundation, if you don't talk about the other big foundation money and only Soros, is pretty suspicious. But anyway, the point is that these people demonize Black Lives Matter. Marjorie Taylor Greene said that Black Lives Matter is the biggest threat to the United States. She campaigned literally doing 2 separate ads, shooting the word socialism, and saying socialism is a threat to the United States. So she says Black people and socialism are threats to the United States. You cannot find common cause with these literal white nationalists. They are far-right demagogues. If you think that they are more representative of your politics than these like so-called democratic socialists, who I have many criticisms of, then that says to me much more about your politics. You're not actually on the left. Obviously, I mean, we can talk about the whole Bernie thing. I was very critical of Bernie and the squad and all of that. I'm very critical of them. But if you genuinely think that Tucker Carlson, who quite literally praises the genocidal British Empire and literally says white supremacist slogans on his TV show and refers to Iraqis as semi-illiterate primitive monkeys, if you say that you have more in common with him than Bernie Sanders, that's saying a lot about you.
Well, I want to just say that too. There is, I think, this like incredible confusion about political leaders and people, right? So if your goal is to win over people who are bamboozled by Trump, they have economic populism, Trump said NATO this, Russia détente that, those aren't things that neither of us opposed. But at the same time, if you're not going to also understand that if you're going to win people over to socialism, you also have to counter the incredible backwardness of the Trump phenomenon. We at Black Agenda Report have been calling the Republican Party the white man's party since way before Donald Trump, because that's the history. The history of the Republican Party, the history of the GOP is when Black people fought for their self-determination, for what some people call civil rights, but really just for fundamental human rights, against segregation, against discrimination, against state violence. Once those efforts started to bear fruit with the Democratic Party, which, Lyndon Johnson was elected at that time, once there started to be modest reforms, that's when all of the Southern reactionary, what we're called Dixiecrats, they flooded the Republican Party, And that is what the Republican Party is right now. So if we're not combating that, we're missing a huge side of, if we're communists, dialectics. There's a huge side of this dialectic of there are these backward ideas. Marjorie Taylor Greene shooting socialism matters. Massive characterizations of Black Lives Matter as just some source-funded operation without understanding the hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people, I should say, who marched under that banner without any organization, but literally want to see racist policing stop. And they want to see a whole lot of other things too around mass incarceration. And if you don't understand how important that is to the class struggle and to socialism and communism, I don't know what we're doing here. Like you gotta address all sides of the dialectic. You can do whatever you want in trying to appeal to that certain subsection. At this point, that's not my strategy, but I'm not going to say you got to come onto my strategy because there's obviously no interest in it. Do you, but understand that here are the objective conditions that automatically place this idea and concept in a very, very perilous situation. And if we care about working class people, I also too, I grew up in Boston, lots of working class whites there, went to school with a lot of them. It was a very quote unquote diverse school system, but the vast majority growing up, and also I work, so I've been working a lot of my life as I balance and juggle this kind of work. Everyone I've met hasn't been, oh my God, we gotta go MAGA this, MAGA that. No, it is actually profound disillusionment, as you said, and complete distrust in the government. Sometimes that's progressive, sometimes that's reactionary, because guess what? The young patriots recognize this. White America has been bamboozled and embedded with racist ideas in order to serve capital. That's the history of the United States. It wasn't just the bourgeoisie that were watching lynchings. That's not how it works. We have to confront this incredible contradiction. This isn't to say all white people are dominated by racist ideas and they're going to act on their racism, but it means that it makes a profound impact on the material conditions of the working class, and it does influence political behavior. Donald Trump would not have campaigned the way he did in both cycles and wouldn't have governed the way he did if it wasn't impactful, if it didn't matter. He wouldn't have talked about China the way he did. He wouldn't have talked about immigrants the way he did. And despite all the contradictions, and this is all true, Trump, a lot of the ways, was stymied in terms of immigration. There were actually fewer deportations because local Democrats were like, okay, we're not going to play ball here because there's not a lot of accountability. It doesn't take a lot of effort to oppose something like this. So actually there were at least a gradual small decrease in the number of deportations. That's not to credit Donald Trump with that. It's to say that there are major contradictions, but at the same time, he's throwing racist red meat. And there are a lot of people who are down with that. This is the history of the United States. This is the current reality of the United States. And the young patriots understood. We can pull it up. I have the interview, Redneck Revolt, of their founding leader, who said this was part of our mission to combat racism within working class white communities because it was a distraction. It actually created disunity. And when we came under the direction of the Black Panther Party, because the Rainbow Coalition was not just we're all equal here. The Black Panther Party, the Young Lords, these organizations were way out in front, and the Young Patriots were very regionally based. They weren't everywhere. They were very regionally based. And they wanted that leadership. And they said, yes, we will. We want to see a multinational working class movement. So why is it that we aren't talking about a multinational working class movement with the understanding that there are major contradictions that we can talk about publicly? It's not canceling. It's not whatever. It's having real, honest political discussions rooted in educating and moving socialist consciousness forward based on the conditions of this very peculiar institution called the United States, which has literally been the most successful at destroying and dividing and absolutely dismembering any kind of socialist movement, in part because these issues are not addressed and are not able to be addressed in kind or adequately.
Absolutely. I mean, Danny, you raised such an important point about the extremely racist, quite literally white supremacist roots of the modern Republican Party. Obviously, I know about party realignment and all that history. I'm not stupid. But in terms of the contemporary Republican Party, they made a deliberate effort to recruit white supremacists. I mean, of course, there are links to the World Anti-Communist League and far-right organizations and fascists. Quite literally, the Republican Party has recruited fascists and white supremacists. Now, I say that knowing very well that the Democrats right now are also supporting fascists in Ukraine. The Democrats have supported fascists abroad as well as the Republicans, because both parties are capitalist imperialist parties, and U.S. imperialism has supported fascists around the world going back many decades, including to Operation Gladio. This is not new, right? Operation Paperclip. This is bipartisan. And just saying that, like, trying to bend over backward to make excuses for Republicans and Trump is just another form of lesser evilism. It has nothing to do with being on the left. It's pure opportunism. Now, as for this fundamental contradiction of national oppression, which is a better term for racism, right? National oppression. There are millions, tens of millions of black people in the United States who are descendants of slaves that were taken over by European colonialists and capitalists to exploit their labor as chattel slaves. And that their descendants have, they need reparations. They need justice. This is a very real problem. And anyone on the left who claims to care about socialism should support the anti-racist struggle, should support black liberation, should support reparations. Now, the Latino community, especially Chicanos, which also, these are people who were colonized by the United States when half of Mexico was stolen in a war of aggression in 1848 and have been systematically discriminated against. Immigrants, systematically discriminated against. Indigenous nations, which is a huge part of this. Millions of indigenous people in the United States who have been treated as second, third-class citizens who deserve, one, the right to their land and self-determination. Absolutely. Up to and including independence. 100%. Indigenous people deserve that. And yet we see such racist condescension from these so-called patriotic socialists and MAGA and all that, whatever. They say, oh, you want to ethnically cleanse hundreds of millions of white people. No one's calling for that. That's absurd. That is a racist mischaracterization of what indigenous nations themselves are calling for when they want their land, when they want self-determination. These are fundamental to the socialist struggle and have been for over 100 years. In fact, going back to the Second International, people talk about the First World War leading to the split of the Second International in World War I. That is true. At that time, they were all called Social Democrats, including the Bolsheviks, were part of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. They split in 1916. But it was not just over the fundamental question of the imperialist war of World War I. The Bolsheviks, who became the communists, and the other parts of the Social Democrats who became the communists, they imposed the imperialist war. But it was also about the recognition that Marxists and communists need to recognize that it's not just the struggle against capitalism. It's also a key part of the struggle against national oppression. And Lenin himself always emphasized in all of his writings up until his death, and when he founded the Comintern, that support for national liberation struggles always had to be at the same level as the struggle against capitalism. They are part of the same struggle. And that includes the national liberation struggles of black people in the United States, of indigenous nations, of Chicanos and other Latinos and other oppressed nations. That includes indigenous people in Hawaii, which is a colony. That includes Puerto Rico, certainly. That includes the indigenous people of Alaska. We need to recognize that the U.S. is not just a capitalist country. It is a settler colonialist country. And if you're a socialist, you have to struggle against that as well. And Lenin himself, when they were creating the Comintern, Lenin himself said that communists should support even bourgeois democratic, national democratic struggles in the colonies, even if they're not led by socialists. He himself said that in the colonies, even if they're led by bourgeois national democratic elements, Marxists and communists should support their liberation struggles. And that certainly includes inside the imperial core as well. And the fact that these so-called MAGA communists who are not communists, these patriotic socialists who are not socialists, the fact that they're so willing to throw black people and Latinos and indigenous nations under the bus to appeal to Trump's base shows once again that they're profoundly unserious and they're simply charlatans.
I hate I think one of the big things that I really dislike, that I really can't stand, I really hate this emphasis on the duopoly. I feel like there is just like there's no attention to what you've been saying, right? Like it's this, okay, there's a supposedly revolutionary trend within this one subsection of the duopoly, and it negates all of this history and all of this, really the current reality of the situation, where when we talk about the national question, there's all of this like cherry picking from Lenin that goes on around this issue. It's like Lenin has a lot of works, and some of his most important, and honestly the most influential works of Lenin are on the national question. That is I don't know who would want to argue about that. I mean, I guess you could argue that his work on organization, sure, but I think that because of the world revolutionary movement and socialist movement that arose after 1917, after the Bolshevik Revolution, it cannot be argued, right? That's what Ho Chi Minh, that's what basically all socialists were holding up, especially those in the colonies. And that's what Lenin recognized, that there was a colonial situation, that Russia, the republics, that the ethnic groups, the nations that were literally trapped within the Tsarist regime, and then of course the parliamentary republic that came after 1905. But there was an entrapping of these nations, that they faced the worst conditions. They were super exploited. And then he learned abroad that was happening. And honestly, the Communist Party of the USA had a huge part in helping in 1920, when, as you said, the Comintern was found, the Third International, in revising Marx's famous statement, Marx and Engels' famous statement, the conclusion of the Communist Manifesto, workers of the world unite. They revised it to workers and oppressed people unite. That's what Lenin did under the leading the Third International, because there was an understanding that oppressed nations were fighting for self-determination, for independence against colonialism, and that was key to the struggle for socialism. If there was going to be any world socialist movement, it's not about supporting imperialist countries or any subsection of imperialist political parties or anything like that. It's about lending full and unconditional solidarity and support to the struggle of the colonies for liberation, national liberation. And at this time, that struggle is unresolved. That just 1920 till 2022, that just didn't end. That is still very much relevant. And it's not about, oh, will people understand this or will people not? Because I think the pushback is, well, you're talking to working class people in a language that they won't understand, so how are you ever going to win anyone over? Well, the strategy should be, if we are trying to instill socialist consciousness, be an agent in this through our work, then we should be talking about all issues from a class analysis, and ensure that while people are struggling for concrete things, while we are hitting on very poignant issues that people do understand, right? The economic situation, Medicare for all, healthcare, all of these things that people talk about now on the daily, right? The healthcare situation, the housing situation, endless wars. People understand that. But then you add in, you have to, we are not tailless. We don't go behind people. We don't say, okay, you know where we need to be, and we're just going to sit there with you because that's going to help. No, that's not going to help anyone. We're getting crushed right now. Like our conditions are worsening. The people are suffering, and people are dying. People are being super exploited. Nations are being destabilized. Communists and socialists, we forge ahead. We say, this is what we believe is the correct ideological path, the correct practical path when we're organizing, when we're in organizational context, I believe when we're in media context, educational context. This is the correct ideological path, how to think about things. This is the correct way to think about these issues to inform your organizing, to inform what you're doing day to day, to bring about, hopefully the end goal, if this is all we can agree on, is to bring about actual communism. I'm I don't believe that's the ultimate goal. I definitely don't share that feeling. But if that is, and I'm wrong, then we really do need to be thinking about what are we focusing on? Why is it? And you brought up the Democratic Party point really well, the Bernie Sanders, AOC, all of that. Why are we dismissing all those forces, right? If Trump forces are duped by Trump, why are we dismissing forces that have maybe been led astray by Democratic socialists, by Bernie Sanders, for example, that have had their hearts broken? I know a lot of people are saying this, hearts absolutely broken and don't know where to go. And what can we do but try to explain the situation and move people in a more revolutionary direction? It seems to me that the conditions are ripe for that. And that's just one example, by no means the only. But I also think, too, before I give it back to you, Ben, is, I have a real problem with this. And it's been a thing that, the Democratic Party, the Republican parties, whatever you want to call it, MAGA, GOP, Democrats, all of them do this. They paint the entire middle of the country, or let's just say the Rust Belt. They paint it all as just bastions of where the working class white American population reside. That is a fundamental error. That is not true. That is a complete oversimplification of the situation. All cities in the Rust Belt that have a population over 100,000 people, it's either a plurality non-white or majority non-white, with many black majority cities, all of these working class people, because blacks, Americans make up a large disproportionate number of working class and poor people in this country, all of which are going to tell your MAGA you can shove that in, in any which way, because we have a different problem in that the Democratic Party is so strong that I'm not mad that the GOP isn't attractive, but on the other side, because it's all about, will we win elections? Can we protect against, the big bad racists? We have another problem where where it's hard to get left ideas out there because of this as well. So we need to address, for me, that's been my organizing principle around my work, is how do we uncover the principal role of the Democratic Party as something that stymies progressive, radical, socialist movements and their development. To me, that seems to be the principal contradiction. And to respond to that principal contradiction as, well, okay, well, let's try it with these MAGA folks, to me misses the point. It misses the actual forces that are being led astray, that have been captured, right, in this duopoly system under the Democratic Party banner, and it just seeds them. Go ahead, go die in the graveyard of social movements. To me, that doesn't seem like sound strategy.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And Danny, you've done such good work on this over many years about the complete failure of the Democratic Party. The idea that either of us is in any way soft on the Democrats is just preposterous. Like, we spent so many years of our lives organizing against the Democrats, trying to build an independent left. But now these people trying to work with Republicans and try to move the left toward the Republicans and not move the Republicans toward the left is pure opportunism. But there's a few points I want to make here that you mentioned. Two points I want to address. One, the ridiculously dishonest, disingenuous misquoting of famous, important revolutionary leaders like Lenin, Mao, and others. I'll come back to that in a second, because it's just so disingenuous. And then also the idea that as the so-called patriotic socialists and the so-called Maga communists, neither of whom are socialists or communists, they claim that it's easier and better to recruit conservatives and Trump supporters than like liberals or social democrats or Bernie supporters. It's completely preposterous. First of all, they also don't understand the most basic history of this. They'll selectively mention a few things about Lenin, like, for instance, Lenin's tried to recruit some people from some groups in Russia that were backward and had some reactionary views. Okay, yeah, that all societies have these contradictions. That doesn't mean that just because someone has reactionary views, they're completely lost, right? That's true, of course, that Lenin recognized that. But what they fail to recognize is that Lenin always understood, Lenin, who, by the way, was not against, who supported building an independent left-wing party and working within the bourgeois parliamentary framework. He was not one of these people who was like, we cannot have any engagement with the bourgeois parliamentary system. He encouraged that, but of course, by building your own leftist party, right? So at the same time, Lenin recognized when the provisional government was created by Kerensky, led by these so-called socialist revolutionaries who were neither socialists nor revolutionaries, the SRs, Lenin took this position saying that we should allow the Social Democrats to fail and recruit the disillusioned social democrat. I mean, at that time, they were all called Social Democrats, which was confusing about it. The Bolsheviks were called Social Democrats, although they were to the left of the socialist revolutionaries. Anyway, whatever. The point is, Lenin recognized that the SRs should be allowed to fail, and then the Bolsheviks should recruit the people who were disillusioned with Kerensky and the SRs. And that's exactly what happened. And there are literally millions of people, especially young people in the United States, but not only young people, who had all this popular energy and enthusiasm, who were excited and politicized by the Bernie movement. I myself was critical of Bernie. I know you were critical of Bernie, but we also recognize that there was genuinely a popular movement behind him, especially a lot of young people who had never been introduced to socialist politics before. This was their first introduction. I know a lot of those people who became socialists and communists and Marxist-Leninists and joined other organizations. The idea that them, or that even people who support like the so-called squad, like I'm not talking about AOC as an individual. I'm talking about people who support them and they're what they claim to be, right? The idea that people who are actually anti-imperialists and socialists and are serious about revolutionary change, the idea that we can't recruit them and try to work with them and develop their politics. Instead, that we should recruit people who are literal conservatives and in some cases are people who are sympathetic to white supremacists and demonize LGBTQ people and demonize immigrants. It is a completely preposterous view. I'm not saying that all conservatives or even all people who vote for Republicans are completely lost and can never be convinced and won over. But if you think that they're the only ones who can be won over and liberals and social democrats and so-called democratic socialists can't be won over, I'm sorry, you're just high. You're either high or you're profoundly unserious and you're a grifter and you're just trying to make money from right-wingers, which I think a lot of these so-called patriotic socialists are doing. Now, the other quick point that I mentioned here, Danny, about misquoting Lenin and Mao. I've seen, for instance, there's been so much misquoting of Lenin on the national question against indigenous liberation, which is incredible. People arguing against giving land back to indigenous nations. I mean, that it's so profoundly unserious and dishonest. But an even more incredibly ridiculous example of this, as I've seen some of these so-called patriotic socialists, they've selectively quoted lines from Mao from Patriotism and Internationalism, which is from this collection from the Red Book, right? The famous Red Book with all the quotes of Mao. He has, in chapter 18, he has a section, Patriotism and Internationalism. And they selectively take lines from what Mao said and literally ignore the main thrust of what Mao was saying. This is what Mao wrote. Can a communist who is an internationalist at the same time be a patriot? We hold that he not only can be, but must be. So, Danny, they take that quote and said from Mao that if you're a communist, you have to be a patriot. But what they leave out is the rest of what Mao said. He said the specific content of patriotism is determined by historical conditions. There is the so-called patriotism of the Japanese aggressors and of Hitler, and there is our patriotism. Communists must resolutely oppose the so-called patriotism of the Japanese aggressors and Hitler. He says the communists of Japan and Germany are defeatists with regard to the wars being waged by their countries. And then later on, he says, the victory of China and the defeat of the invading imperialists will help the people of other countries. Thus, in wars of national liberation, patriotism is applied to internationalism. He's literally saying the opposite of what the so-called patriotic socialists are saying. He's saying, in the context of an imperialist nation, you have to wish for the defeat, revolutionary defeatism of your own so-called government. That is, the U.S. government must be defeated. the European imperialist governments must be defeated. He's not saying that you should be a U.S. patriot. He's saying you should wish for the defeat of the U.S. government against the revolutionary patriotic struggles of the colonies, of people in the core, I mean, in the periphery, not in the core, of people in the so-called third world, in the global south. Their patriotic struggles against imperialism are progressive. The so-called patriotic struggles in the imperial core must be struggles of revolutionary defeatism against the imperialist government. So you can't take the patriotic and also nationalist struggles that are left-wing and progressive struggles against imperialism in the global south, in Cuba, in Vietnam, in Korea, in the Congo, in Zimbabwe and Mozambique and Angola and Nicaragua. You can't take those nationalist left-wing struggles and then transpose that into the imperial core, especially to a settler colonialist country where decolonization has actually we've never had decolonization in the United States. We need decolonization, and you can't talk about patriotism until you have decolonization.
Yeah, and I think also too is if, you know, again, and often a counter, right, is that we, you know, that there's an interest in using the messaging of American patriotism to align it with socialist and communist principles. And now it's not like this doesn't have historical precedent. I mean, this has been a struggle amongst left forces, working class organizations. The CP had a lot of struggles with this. Even the Black Panther Party, right, cited the American Declaration of Independence in their initial 10-point program to state why they were coming out against the U.S. government and saying these are the things that we want unconditionally, which also included a national plebiscite, basically separating Black America from the rest of the country. But that's neither here nor there. The point is that if you want to say that American patriotism, and I'm open, Midwestern Marx and forces like this, I'm open to having conversations. If you want to try to apply that model to concrete working class organization, to certain forces that you may think really need to hear that first, then I'm open to you doing that. However, there's I think a really just to me just a complete and utter distortion of Marxism and of socialism, which says that American patriotism is akin to the patriotism that was forged during national liberation movements for independence and or socialism. And that to me is one of the most egregious, insulting, absolutely disgusting distortions, because there is nothing similar between the patriotism, the nationalism, like for example in China or in Cuba, to that has been developed in the United States. There is absolutely nothing similar. It completely flies in the face of the relationship between imperialist countries and oppressed countries, imperialist nations and oppressed nations. There's nothing at all similar, right? There are oppressed nations in the United States. The U.S. as a whole is not an oppressed nation. It is an oppressor nation, if we're going to use the language that also Lenin used to describe imperialist countries. It is an oppressor nation that exploits and super exploits nations in the United States, in these borders, as well as outside of them. That patriotism cannot just be dogmatically generalized to be equal to or akin to the very patriotism that responded to imperialism. That was a response to the century of humiliation in China, to the semi-colonial, neo-colonial arrangement that Cuba found itself in for so many decades. It just cannot be compared, and it doesn't help because without making that differentiation, people are going to be confused about the differences between these countries, and once they find out, they may not be open to it anymore. They may not be like, I am all for. If you are for, this is one of the things that I appreciate, especially in the early period during this discussion when it first emerged among patriotic socialists. Now, Maga Communism I see is a lot less serious, but when Midwestern Marxist these forces we're talking about, Patriot, like all of them, they support unconditionally socialist countries, right? And that is very commendable. However, to take this then and to try to create a relationship that doesn't exist, one that actually there's a huge difference between, then we're talking about distortions for what, right? We don't have to. We just can see things clearly. We can see that the Cuban Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, we can see that national liberation struggles were fighting for things that are quite different than what American patriotism inherently from its foundations is consumed with, is prioritized with. And no matter how you try to spin it, even if you want to brand yourself as an American patriot who agrees with everything about socialist countries and national liberation struggles, even then we're talking about likely something that is going to fail quite soon, because this doesn't have any practical application. Most folks who are the most vehemently patriotic are the most vehemently anti-communist. And so how do you reckon with that contradiction? That is the roots. When there have been upsurges in the modern period of patriotism in the United States, it's been during Jim Crow and during the era of McCarthyism, during the War on Terror. Those were not good periods for socialists, for communists, and for anyone struggling for liberation from imperialism.
Yeah, and we have to also think about not even just the fundamental distinction in that patriotism and nationalism. I get that they're not exactly the same thing. I get that people try to split hairs, but they're very closely related phenomena. In a country that is colonized or partially colonized, patriotism and nationalism can be progressive. Not always, but they usually can be a progressive force of unifying the oppressed nation against the foreign occupier, against colonialism and imperialism, especially when that movement is, of course, led by a socialist, led by a progressive. We've seen many examples across the global South. You can't in any way compare that to so-called patriotism in the imperial core. But even aside from that, we have to acknowledge the material reality of the history of so-called patriotism in the United States, its connotations with things like you were just talking about, with McCarthyism, slavery, with Jim Crow and lynchings, with the War on Terror. You can't separate that history of patriotism and say we're just redefining patriotism to mean what we want it to mean, and we're going to reappropriate national symbols to mean what we want them to mean. You can't do that. Now, imagine a leftist, a socialist, even a communist in apartheid Israel decided they want to reappropriate the Israeli flag and try to build a patriotic Israeli communist movement. That would be preposterous, completely ludicrous. Anyone who would try that would be insane. But why is it so different in the United States? Clearly, Palestinians would be completely suspicious of anyone trying to reappropriate the Israeli flag. But ask people in Puerto Rico, in the United States, in itself, in oppressed nations, among indigenous nations, Latino communities. Ask especially people across West Asia, North Africa, and in Latin America. I know Latin America pretty well. The symbol of the U.S. flag here is seen as a symbol of oppression to a level that's not so different from the Nazi flag. You cannot reappropriate a symbol. Imagine German communists are going to try to reappropriate the Nazi flag. Just like the Third Reich, which murdered millions of people through a process of brutal genocidal colonialism, the U.S. government did the same thing to indigenous nations, to people in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Yemen, in Venezuela right now, in Iran, in Korea, in Vietnam. You can't just take this symbol and reappropriate it and say it's now a symbol of progressive values and communism and socialism and Marx. This is completely preposterous. And then also that's ignoring the fact that, as anyone who spent significant time in the United States knows, people who tend to fly the U.S. flag in the U.S. are almost always on the right wing and very significantly to the right. Even, more moderate liberals and progressives tend to not use the U.S. flag. You can't just take that historical context and remove it and reappropriate it. I don't want to spend like an hour talking about the debate about the US flag specifically, but it's not just about the flag. I'm just talking about in general that you can't just redefine patriotism and ignore all of that historical baggage and then say now it means something different and progressive. You're not a historical materialist if you try to do that. Marx himself said this is basic Marxism. He said that we inherit the past and it weighs on us like a nightmare on the brain of the living. Men do not create history, but we inherit history and it weighs on us like a nightmare on the brain of the living. The reality of the history of U.S. settler colonialism and white supremacy and Jim Crow and genocide, we cannot ignore that, especially because there's never been a process of decolonization. And you've mentioned it, and I think we need to be open about it. That includes up to and including separation for indigenous communities that want their own nations, their own countries. And I mean, the Black Belt thesis is no longer, very prominent on the Black left. But if, as an oppressed nation, if Black people want that, then if you're serious about being a socialist or a communist and fighting against national oppression, these are serious discussions we need to have. Certainly for Hawaii, certainly for Puerto Rico, certainly for so-called, territories, and even inside the so-called United States. There's nothing holy about these colonial borders in the United States. So, we need to have serious conversations about these, and instead of just trying to reappropriate these symbols, we should actually have a discussion of what an actual socialist government in the territory that is today the United States would look like, including through decolonization. And finally, last thing I'll say is, and this doesn't mean that I'm not one of those people who say you should go up to a worker and tell them they're a settler and you should burn the U.S. flag and say America with 3 K. Obviously, and I'm not saying we should say America with 3 Ks and all of that. No, clearly, yes, you need to find a way to engage with working people who might not be familiar with your views, who probably have a lot of baggage and propaganda internalized against communism and socialism, clearly. But there's a big gap in between these MAGA communists who are not communists and these patriotic socialists on one side and the America burn the U.S. flag on the other side. I think obviously people should have the right to burn the U.S. flag, but it's not either or. And that's what these patriotic socialists do, is they make this straw man argument where they say, if you don't support waving the genocidal U.S. flag and trying to bring back make America great again, even though it was never great, if you don't agree with them, therefore you support ethnic cleansing of 200 million people in the United States. That's not a serious argument.
Yeah. And just to one quick addition before we close up the conversation, there's going to be a lot of issues that people take. It's a very especially around the flag, but even just this comparison, right, between Nazism and American patriotism. Very, it must be said that let's just take, and I think this is a really very, very, very important example, and you mentioned it, Jim Crow. Many people don't know the history about this, right? There was Black Reconstruction after the Civil War. There was a real attempt, in my opinion, the first attempt in the United States to build bourgeois democracy. I do not believe 1776, 1783, those were not attempts to build bourgeois, quote unquote, democracy. There was still very much vestiges of whatever the hell you want to call it, but it wasn't free, open form, so-called free market capitalism, bourgeois democracy. But Black people were leading, right? We have public education in the United States because of Black Reconstruction. You had this incredible movement to try to actually begin the process of having a working class that was fully equal, and Black people were leading that was fully equal with political rights, right? Not necessarily economic rights, because that's where Jim Crow came to be. That's how it came to be. That's where you had the massive lynchings and the state repression, where you had the complete abandonment of the federal government of those who were trying to build this all across the Black Belt and all across the former slaver South. And so with that came what was the first, at least that's what I have come to know, and it's not a popular opinion, but the first experiment with fascism was Jim Crow, was the complete and total repression of bourgeois democracy itself for Black people as a way to suppress the entire class struggle, because there was an awareness amongst capital that if all workers had the same rights, then what would it lead to? It would lead to the eventual, because there was also organizing being done. There was the first rudiments of pressure against industrial capital that would then eventually lead into the industrial organizing the future. But Jim Crow was the first experiment, and Adolf Hitler himself acknowledged that because he was very much influenced by it. So we have to acknowledge that this history has a profound influence on, if we just want to say, the modern GOP, even just the modern political situation in the United States. And my final word is that I don't think that working class people are dumb. I don't think working class whites are stupid people. I think they understand this history. It's a very painful one, and it's one that still many people participate in, right? And it's not something that can be said, right? There's a lot of people who go and join police forces, white and Black, and this is how the state works. And so these things must be addressed, and if we're serious about socialism, then we have to be serious about everything, I think, that we've been bringing up here. And I'm glad that we were able to have what I think is a final word on this, because, I think there was a lot of, and I know some folks who I think are good faith folks who, are trying to figure this out themselves. I have my particular position. I know a lot of socialist patriots who, are trying to figure out, well, what's a balance for them. And I'm not saying, right, I would say if it were the ideal, but I'm not idealistic, drop it, it doesn't make any sense. Test it out, but you're probably going to drop it because it's not material. We're not touching and feeling this. We're literally just, reinforcing very common ideas. We're not bringing anything new to the workers. We're not bringing anything new to oppressed people. But if you're not going to do that, at least consider what has been said here and, attempt to apply it and see which wins out. That's really all I ask of those who consider those actual communists, whether they are or not, right? This is a lot of online stuff. I don't know any of them, but I see the behavior. I see the kind of like Trump worship, a lot of personality stuff, a lot of this. I mean, that's just immature stuff. I mean, there's just so much that could be said, but and also the personalities, right? Everyone wants to debate, but when it's not on your terms, right? When it's not on your terms, you want to debate us, but it's not on your terms, and oh no, we can't do it, right? There's a lot of this. There's a lot of weird hedging, and I don't do that stuff, Ben. I know you don't do that. We both try to conduct our work very professionally in the broadest sense. But if you were to take the Leninist concept of professional revolutionary, you don't engage in distractions. That's why we focus on the ideas, the concepts, the fact that no one is the property of ideas. Even Lenin himself, Marx himself, that's not their property. They didn't come up with it so you could just valorize them and worship them. I mean, I got a lot of love for them, but at the same time, that's not it. It's that these ideas come from a material base, and they are then debated and struggled with both on the streets, on the ground, and also in real intellectual conversations, disagreements that are done in good faith. But a lot of this is not. It's about we're right, and that's it.
Yeah, I mean, I have a few closing thoughts here. Just one final word on this flag issue, because sometimes it becomes like a big debate about the flag. And obviously, this whole debate about so-called patriotic socialism is not just about the flag, although the symbolism can make it easy to get trapped in that. So that's why we wait until the end to talk about this. I just want to mention briefly here. Lenin himself always strongly emphasized the importance of fighting against what he called greater Russian chauvinism. He always highly emphasized the importance of socialists in the Russian Empire to challenge greater Russian chauvinism. And the Bolsheviks were not around waving Russian flags. The Russian model is important to study because, for better or for worse, the reality of history is that the Russian Revolution was the only successful socialist revolution ever in an imperialist country. That's the reality of history. I think Marx was right about almost everything, but there are a few things he was wrong about, Marx and Engels. They thought that the socialist revolution would start in the most developed, industrialized capitalist nations, especially Germany. It didn't happen. There was an attempt in 1918 in Germany, and it was crushed, ironically, with the support of the Social Democrats in alliance with the far right, with the kind of MAGA of Germany, if you will, make Germany great again people, the Freikorps. Anyway, the point is that the Russian example is interesting because every other successful socialist revolution since then has been in a colonized or partially colonized country. Mao's analysis of China, it was partially colonized, partially feudal, partially capitalist. So, furthermore, the Bolsheviks were not going around waving the Tsarist Russian flag. On the contrary, the Bolsheviks were attacked by other people on the left, including the so-called socialist revolutionaries, who were neither socialists nor revolutionaries. They were attacked by them for the Treaty of Brest. What was the Treaty of Brest? In 1918, the Bolsheviks ended the Russian Empire, and they gave away what had been territories of the Russian Empire. And a lot of people on the so-called left in Russia were very angry against them, very angry at them, because they worshipped the imperial borders of the Russian Empire, just as a lot of these so-called patriotic socialists cannot imagine parts of colonial U.S. territory being given up and these sacred borders with 50 states and whatever, these territories. No, I mean, there's nothing sacred, nothing in stone. And I think anyone who's serious about socialism, and especially revolutionary socialism, should not in any way be concerned about these colonial borders. There's the issue of the flags as well. What happened after the Russian Revolution? They created a new flag. What happened after the Chinese Revolution? The Chinese dynasties had many different flags. They created a new flag. So, I mean, I don't want to make this all about the flag, right? This is a much larger debate. But the point is, the flag is a symbol of the larger contradiction. Lenin was warning against greater Russian chauvinism, and he gave away large parts of the Russian Empire because he understood that the project of building socialism was not about preserving the Russian Empire. Now, there's another point I wanted to. I know this is the end. I know you got to go. We're almost at 2 hours. This is a whole other long conversation, but I just need to bring it up. I mentioned the F word, fascism, right? I'm not saying that every single person who, especially younger people who might have been interested in this whole patriotic socialism thing and might be well-intentioned, I'm not saying that they're all fascists, but there genuinely are fascists, literal fascists who are calling themselves patriotic socialists and so-called Maga communists who are not communists. And we need to understand that fascism, yes, fascism is the tool that the capitalist class uses at times of capitalist crisis to crush the left and any systemic alternatives to save capitalism at a moment of crisis. As was famously said, fascism is capitalism in decay. Okay, yeah, that's true. Fascism is also a little more complicated. Fascism has always been syncretic in the sense that fascists have always willingly tried to co-opt and exploit and distort elements of the left and combine it with the far right. We see this throughout history. We see this with the so-called third position or third positionism. Fascists say, oh, we're neither left nor right. And when you see this kind of rhetoric, it's not the left versus right. We should left and right unite against the center. The left has never called for that. Fascists have. And then, of course, what they do is they destroy the left after. It's not a coincidence that the Nazis, who are not socialists, I'm not saying that they're socialists, they were not in any way. In fact, the Nazis oversaw more capitalist privatization than any other country in Europe in the 1930s. The Nazis. Of course, they did so with massive slave labor. It was actually bringing back to feudalism. And in many ways, fascism is bringing back feudalism. and elements with capitalism, right? With industrial capitalism, but feudalism, enslavement, which was a huge part of the feudal economy, extermination and genocide to remove indigenous populations to have these large plantations, which is exactly, the US feudal capitalist model. So anyway, but the point is that when you see these people who are like, it's not left versus right, trying to co-opt elements of left-wing rhetoric, there's a historical precedent of that. Mussolini himself came out of the Italian Socialist Party. He was not a socialist. In fact, Mussolini later said, he wrote, people ask us, he's talking about the fascists. People ask us, the fascists, what our mission is. Our mission is to crush the skull of the socialists, to crush the skulls of the socialists. Mussolini said that. I'm not saying that the Nazis and the Italian fascists were socialists. They were not socialists. The first people in the concentration camps created by the Nazis were the communists, and then labor organizers and socialists and Romani and Jews and LGBT people and black people and disabled people. But the first people were communists. And that famous slogan from Niemöller, it's, when they came for the communists, I said nothing. The first word is the communists. So the point is that fascism has a history of portraying itself as anti-hegemonic, even revolutionary, portraying as itself as against the state, even against the bourgeoisie, even though we know that the German bourgeois elements, especially the big bourgeoisie, used the Nazis to try to destroy the communists. And in the case of Italy, the Italian monarchy welcomed in Mussolini because the Italian monarchy thought that Mussolini could be used to destroy the communists in Italy. And it was the communists in both Germany and Italy who defeated fascism. But we need to understand again that this idea of syncretic politics, of trying to take elements of the right and left and combine them, is something that fascists have done historically. And when you see these so-called patriotic socialists, I've seen them, these weirdos on Twitter. Again, they're not in real life. This is mostly just online. But you'll see them quoting sometimes Mussolini or actual fascists or whatever. Like, no, that's not, there's nothing left-wing about that. That is third positionism. That is literal fascism. So we just need to be very careful about these kinds of things because there are actual fascists trying to exploit this rhetoric. And the whole idea of trying to combine the far right and the left, that's the left, no left-wing movement that was ever successful has ever done that. It is simply a disaster. It's a recipe for disaster, and it is profoundly unserious.
Well, I think we can put the final word on this there. I do want to say thank you, Ben. I do, unfortunately, yes, do need to go soon. I need to get to a few announcements, but it was good to have you on today. Please do follow Ben at Multipolarista and all the different ways, support it. And yeah, we'll talk again soon. And everyone stick around because I got some announcements coming up.
Thanks, Danny. It was a real pleasure. And I'm glad we could talk about this because I don't plan on talking about it anymore after this. So when people ask, I'll be like, check out this video I did with Danny. Thanks.
All right. Take care. There you are. Sorry about that. All right. Take care. So, all right. So one thing I want to say in terms of stick around, I got announcements. I do want to just add one thing about social conservatism because I see a lot of chatter about that in the chat. My position on that is that not everyone is going to agree. I think these culture war issues, even quote unquote identity politics, we have to be very nuanced about that. On the one hand, a lot of identity politics are actually class struggle issues. A lot of class struggle issues are quote unquote identity politics. For example, discrimination that LGBTQ plus people, especially trans people, queer people face, discrimination, oppression that black people face. But these are all class struggle issues. It's when the ruling class, the bourgeoisie, makes them into quote unquote neoliberal identity politics. That's where we run into the real issue. And so, in my opinion, social conservatism is not something we embrace, even if it exists. It's not something we say, oh, we're okay with that. We're not going to try to force people out of things that aren't material issues, right? But we are going to also understand social conservatism as a rudiment of the economic system and the political system that we live in. And also when there are backwards ideas that affect the class struggle, affect actual class struggle unity, because I think a lot of quote unquote social conservatism actually does that. It scapegoats certain groups of people and says that they're all written off or worse, right? Subject to discrimination, violence, etc. We're going to address that. So that, that it should be as basic as that. It should really be as basic as that. But with that said, everyone, I want to announce a few things before I get out of here because I have an appointment not too long from now. One, tomorrow, right? So you want to subscribe to this channel and keep liking this video as well before you leave. But before you leave, just understand tomorrow I have Vijay Prashad and Noam Chomsky coming on to talk about The Withdrawal, the book that they've written. It's called The Withdrawal, Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, the Fragility of U.S. Power. We're going to be talking about the concepts in that book because I think it's a really poignant conversation, and it's going to be, I think, a really good interview. So 12:30 p.m. Eastern tomorrow. So subscribe to this channel. You will be notified. I always post to the community, so make sure you're there. And then last word on support. So, of course, subscribe to this channel, like this video, but the best way to support me is on Patreon at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong, patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. That's how you support the technology, all of the things that this channel takes, all of the labor that goes into the channel itself, and also my writing and all sorts of other efforts and things that I am involved with. That's how you support it at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. But with all that said, everyone, I think this was a good conversation. Hopefully, Ben and I can collaborate more on questions like this or more serious ones. Honestly, as we talked about earlier in the program, I'm sure there will be more collaboration so we can build together a serious movement, a serious mass movement, because I'm a socialist, I'm a communist, but I'm about a serious mass movement, serious political education, resources for people to be able to understand the United States as it is, what it represents. And that's been my work from the very beginning, from all the way back 2013, I guess I started writing, but all the way back 2010, 11, when I first got into activism. That's been my political process, my journey into what is a world struggle for socialism and liberation. And please do come back if you're new to the channel. All right. So please do like the video before you leave. Of course, all that good stuff. Subscribe, notifications bell. And of course, hit up Patreon or Substack. You can do an annual subscription to Substack. And there are many other ways to support. But with that said, everyone, peace out. I will see you all hopefully tomorrow afternoon at 12:30, where I will also announce a really great event that Friends of Socialist China is holding. So you want to definitely stay tuned for that as well. Take good care and bye-bye.